My husband slapped me across the face the moment his mother whispered into his ear. The sting burned, but what hurt more was the smirk of satisfaction on her lips as I fell to the cold floor. For years, I had been told I was too sensitive, too naive, too ungrateful. Tonight, however, something inside me snapped. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I looked up, and for the first time, Ethan froze at my stare, because what he didn't know, what neither of them could imagine, was that I had been preparing for this night all along. From the outside, my life looked enviable. People often told me how lucky I was to have Ethan, successful, charming, the kind of man who turned heads when he entered a room. They admired our house, a glass and steel marvel I had designed myself, as if the walls and windows proved the solidity of our marriage. They saw the dinner parties, the tailored suits, the photographs of us smiling against the backdrop of summer vacations. I let them believe the illusion because illusions are easier to maintain than truths, but even the most polished glass shows cracks if you look closely enough. Ethan told me often that he loved me, but when I asked about the joint account, I discovered only his name was listed. He dismissed my concern with a laugh, calling me paranoid. "You don't need to worry about money, Maddie," he said. "I've got everything handled." At the time, I wanted to believe him. Yet the thought gnawed at me, the kind of detail that burrows beneath the skin and never leaves. Margaret, my mother-in-law, added another layer to the façade. She presented herself as caring, even doting, but her words carried barbs hidden in silk. "You work so hard, dear," she told me one evening, "though I suppose Ethan doesn't mind. It makes him feel like the provider, you know." I forced a smile, but inside I burned. Every comment was framed as concern, but beneath it lay disdain. Each barb lodged itself deeper until I found myself rehearsing responses in my head, only to swallow them when she was near. The control extended beyond words. Each purchase I made required an explanation. A new sketchbook, a dress, even a coffee on my way to the studio. Ethan wanted receipts, just for budgeting. His tone was light, teasing even, but the pattern was suffocating. I began to realize how little space was truly mine. My career as an architect had once been my anchor, but even that he tried to steer. "You should take fewer projects," he said. "Focus on the home." Isn't that what real happiness is? I told myself he loved me, that he only wanted the best for us. But why, then, did I feel like a prisoner dressed in silk? I started writing things down. Small at first, comments, glances, the way Margaret's eyes lingered on me when Ethan wasn't watching. I filled entire notebooks with fragments of conversations, details I thought might seem trivial to anyone else but pressed heavy on me. At times, I reread them and wondered if I was imagining everything. Was I, as Ethan claimed, too sensitive? Too dramatic? Then came the night that ripped away doubt. Ethan had left his phone charging in the kitchen. I wasn't looking for anything, not really, but when the screen lit up with Margaret's name, curiosity overcame caution. I opened the thread, and there it was. Messages exchanged late into the night, not of a mother advising her son, but of conspirators planning their next move. Margaret had written, "She's stubborn. Push her to sign those transfer papers before she realizes what's happening. Remind her she owes everything to you." Ethan replied, "Don't worry, she trusts me. She won't see it coming." My hands trembled as I scrolled. It wasn't just about money. They spoke about me like a liability to be managed, a piece of property to be reshaped. My entire marriage, the love I thought we shared, reduced to strategy. I dropped the phone back onto the counter, my pulse pounding so loudly I thought it might wake the house. That night, I didn't sleep. Instead, I stared at the ceiling, playing their words over and over in my mind. If it were you, what would you do? Would you still trust the man lying beside you, or the evidence glowing on the screen? The truth hit me like cold water. This wasn't marriage. This was a cage built of money, reputation, and manipulation. I wasn't a wife in Ethan's eyes. I was leverage, a means to protect the Carter family name and fortune. I pressed my palm against my chest, feeling the rhythm of my heart, not to calm myself, but to remind me I was still alive. And with that realization came something else, anger sharp enough to cut, and resolve stronger than fear. The illusion had shattered, and once glass breaks, no matter how carefully you try to piece it back together, the cracks always remain. After that night, I knew there was no turning back. The texts I had read weren't suspicions scribbled in a notebook or half-formed doubts replaying in my head. They were proof. Proof that Ethan and Margaret had plans for me far colder and crueler than I had ever imagined. The question was no longer whether I was imagining things. The question became, how do I survive this game without them realizing I know the rules? I began with silence. I kept my voice light, my smile soft, my eyes lowered whenever Ethan looked at me too closely. I laughed when he made jokes that hurt. I agreed when Margaret offered advice that tasted of poison. Outwardly, I was still the obedient wife, still grateful, still blind. Inside, however, I had started building an arsenal. I bought a small recording device, no larger than a lipstick tube. The first time I slipped it behind the frame of a family photograph, my hands shook so badly I almost dropped it. Every creak of the wooden floor sounded like thunder in my ears. I told myself to breathe, to stay steady, because one mistake could undo everything. Hours later, when I retrieved the device and played it back, Margaret's voice filled the tiny speaker. "Push her harder. She won't resist if you act like you're protecting her." It was working. Day by day, I expanded my methods. I copied documents, took pictures of bank statements, emailed files to myself and hid them under false names. I learned how to move like a shadow in my own home. Once, while dusting the bookshelf, I slipped another recorder behind Ethan's law journals. Minutes later, he walked into the room. "What are you doing?" he asked, suspicion flickering in his eyes. My heart thudded so violently I was sure he could hear it. "Just cleaning," I said, holding up a rag, forcing a smile. He studied me for a moment, then nodded and left. My knees almost gave out with relief. That night, lying beside him, I stared at the ceiling, thinking, one slip, and I would be finished. But I couldn't fight this alone. I needed someone who understood. That was when I found Claire. She was a lawyer recommended quietly by a women's shelter. When we met in her office, she extended her hand and said, "You don't need to tell me everything today. Just tell me enough to know where we begin." Her eyes carried the weight of someone who had lived what I was living. I told her about the texts, the recordings, the money. She listened without interruption, jotting notes, and when I finished, she leaned forward. "You're not crazy," she said firmly, "and you're not powerless." For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. Still, the danger pressed in from all sides. That pressure grew sharper when an old friend, Daniel, resurfaced. We hadn't spoken in years, but he reached out, saying he had information I needed to see. We met in a quiet cafe where he slid a folder across the table. Inside were documents, financial records that Ethan had hidden, accounts under different names, transfers linked to his company. I stared at them, my stomach twisting. Proof. More proof. Daniel hesitated before speaking. "There's something else, Maddie. I didn't know if I should tell you, but you deserve to know. Ethan's been preparing legal documents, custody petitions. He's planning to argue you're unfit, to take away your right to children you don't even have yet." His words gutted me. For a moment, the air left my lungs. I thought of the nights Ethan had pressed against me, talking about a future, about family. I thought of the times Margaret had smiled sweetly, asking if we'd considered children. And now I understood. Even my womb had been reduced to a weapon in their game. I made it home before Ethan. In the bathroom, I turned on the faucet to drown out my sobs and sank to the floor. The documents clutched in my hands blurred as tears ran down my face. I wasn't strong, not then. I wasn't a warrior plotting victory. I was a woman betrayed by the man I had loved, by the family I had tried to belong to. But grief eventually cooled into something sharper. Sitting on those tiles, I wiped my tears with the back of my hand and stared at my reflection in the mirror. My eyes were red, swollen, but beneath them I saw a glimmer, anger, determination. They wanted me broken, pliant, helpless. I would give them the opposite. When Ethan came home, I smiled. I kissed his cheek, set dinner on the table, and laughed at his stories. He never suspected the storm I was preparing. The hardest part of my plan was not gathering proof or finding allies. It was waiting. Every morning I woke up beside Ethan. Every evening I sat across from him at dinner. And every night I lay in the same bed, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing. To him, I was still the loyal wife, the woman who smiled when he spoke, who nodded when Margaret made her helpful remarks. But beneath the mask, I was someone else entirely. Have you ever smiled at the very person who hurt you most? I have. I did it every day, my lips curving while my heart clenched in silence. Sometimes I wondered if my act was too perfect, if Ethan sensed the coldness I kept buried. But he never looked closer, never noticed the distance. He believed in the illusion he himself had built. Madeline Carter, dutiful wife. There were nights when the temptation nearly consumed me, the urge to throw the recordings in his face, to show him the bank statements, the text messages, to scream, "I know who you are." My hands would tremble on the edge of my desk, staring at the evidence stored on a flash drive, imagining his expression when the truth crashed down. But every time, I stopped myself. One wrong move, one misstep, and everything would collapse. I would lose before the war even began. So I waited. I studied. I observed. Ethan was a man driven by hunger, power, control, the desperate need to prove he was untouchable. He could not stand the idea of weakness, not in himself, not in anyone close to him. When colleagues questioned him, he lashed out in subtle but cutting ways, dismantling them with words that looked like charm but felt like knives. I watched the way he flinched at the possibility of failure, the way his smile tightened whenever someone else earned praise. His fear of losing face was a chain around his neck, one I knew I could one day yank. Margaret, however, was different. Her obsession wasn't money or power. It was the Carter name. To her, reputation was sacred, a banner she would defend at all costs. She saw me not as a daughter-in-law, but as a threat, a fracture in the image she worshipped. The more she tried to veil her disdain with sweet tones, the clearer it became. Every sigh, every loaded question about when Ethan and I might have children, every backhanded compliment was another confirmation. She wanted me erased. And so I gave her what she wanted to see. I played the weak daughter-in-law. I let my voice falter, let my shoulders slump, let her believe her words cut deeper than they did. Sometimes she softened, letting her guard down just long enough to reveal more than she should. That was what I needed. One afternoon, as we sat in her ornate living room, Margaret poured tea into delicate china cups. Her pearls gleamed against the collar of her blouse, her smile polished as ever. "Madeline," she said, "you really ought to learn how to manage appearances better. Ethan carries enough weight without you, complicating things." I lowered my eyes, whispering, "I'm sorry. I don't want to make trouble." She leaned closer, the scent of her perfume sharp, almost metallic. "Then don't. We've had enough scandals in this family already. If the truth about the company ever came out—" She stopped herself, biting the inside of her cheek. My head lifted just enough for my eyes to meet hers. "The company?" I asked softly, feigning confusion. Margaret's smile froze, the kind of pause so brief most people would miss it. But I didn't. I stored it away, another crack in their perfect façade. She changed the subject quickly, talking about charity events and guest lists, but the damage was done. She had let something slip. Something bigger than my marriage, bigger than her personal disdain for me. That night, I replayed her words over and over. A scandal. Something hidden in the family business. My chest tightened as I realized the scope of what I had uncovered. This wasn't just about Ethan controlling our finances or Margaret undermining me at the dinner table. This was wrought at the very core of their empire. I closed my notebook after writing down every detail. The evidence I had was strong, but now I sensed something even greater was waiting to be revealed. For the first time, I understood. They weren't just my enemies. They were their own worst enemies. and all I had to do was wait for them to expose themselves completely. Patience had never been my strength, but in this war, patience was my most dangerous weapon. The night of the dinner had a stillness that felt unnatural, as if the air itself were waiting to witness what was about to happen. Margaret had arranged the meal with her usual sense of ceremony: crystal glasses that caught the light, polished silverware, a table set to impress. I sat quietly, every gesture rehearsed, my mask flawless. Inside, though, I was a taut wire, stretched to breaking. Conversation flowed in shallow waves, Margaret complimenting Ethan's latest business deal, Ethan recounting some anecdote meant to display his cleverness. I laughed where appropriate, sipped my wine, pushed food around my plate. My chest tightened with every second. I could feel the moment approaching, like the hush before a storm. Then it happened. Margaret leaned closer to her son, her lips barely moving. I couldn't hear the words, but I didn't need to. Whatever she said, it was enough. Ethan's jaw hardened, and without warning, his hand lashed out. The slap cracked against my cheek so violently that my chair tipped backward. I hit the floor, the shock ringing through my bones. The room fell silent, broken only by the faint clink of a spoon sliding off a plate. For a breath, I stayed down. The sting burned across my face, but pain was nothing compared to the clarity surging through me. Slowly, I lifted myself up. Ethan had already turned away, adjusting his cuff as though nothing had happened. Margaret's smirk lingered, small, satisfied. But when my eyes met Ethan's back, something inside me steadied. "Ethan," I said, my voice sharp enough to cut through the silence. He paused, shoulders stiffening, then turned halfway, expecting tears, begging submission. What he saw instead was me standing tall, my hand pulling a small silver USB from my pocket. "Do you want everyone here to hear your voice from last night?" His face drained of color. Around us, the other relatives froze, eyes darting from him to me. I pressed the device onto the table, my hand steady now. With a click, the recording filled the room. Margaret's voice, sharp and unmistakable. "Push her to sign those papers. She won't resist if you act like you're protecting her." Then Ethan's, "She trusts me. She won't see it coming." The words hung in the air like smoke, suffocating and undeniable. The guests at the table shifted uncomfortably. One cousin coughed into his napkin. Another stared openly, wide-eyed. Margaret's lips parted in horror, her hand trembling as she reached for her glass. Ethan's fists clenched at his sides, his face rigid with panic. I let the recording play a little longer, each phrase damning them further before I switched it off. The silence afterward was heavier than the slap had been. "Careful, Ethan," I said softly, but loud enough for all to hear. "You've underestimated me." He lunged toward the USB, desperation flickering across his face. For a moment his fingers brushed against the device, but I pulled it back and smiled. "Don't bother," I told him, my tone calm. "I've already made copies, one with my lawyer, one with a friend. If anything happens to me, you both know exactly what will be unleashed." Gasps circled the table. Margaret's hand shook so violently her glass toppled, red wine spilling across the white tablecloth like blood. Ethan's chest rose and fell quickly, his façade cracking in front of the very family he sought to impress. That was the moment I knew I had shifted the balance. For months I had been on the defensive, building quietly in shadows. Now, in one single blow, I had dragged their schemes into the light. Dinner ended in chaos. No one knew what to say. Margaret's attempt to salvage dignity failed as she muttered excuses, her voice brittle. Ethan stormed from the room, veins visible at his temples. I remained composed, collecting the USB and slipping it back into my pocket. Later, when the house quieted, I moved through the halls one final time. Every painting, every polished surface, every corner seemed to whisper of the years I had spent trapped here, playing the obedient wife. But I wasn't leaving empty-handed. I had weapons now, truth, proof, and the courage they thought they had beaten out of me. I packed only what I needed: a bag with essentials, the evidence I had collected, the folders Daniel had given me. Standing in the doorway of the bedroom I once thought was a sanctuary, I felt no regret, only resolve. When I stepped outside into the cool night air, the world felt different, sharper, freer. Behind me, the house loomed like a cage I had finally broken. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger even, but also the chance to fight on my own terms. I whispered to myself almost like a vow, "This time, they won't see me coming." And with that, I walked away, not as a victim fleeing, but as a strategist carrying the first weapon of war. Leaving the Carter estate that night felt like liberation, but it was only the beginning. I knew Ethan and Margaret would not surrender easily. Their pride, their obsession with control, their addiction to power, it guaranteed retaliation. I braced myself for it, but even then, I wasn't fully prepared for the force with which they struck back. The first blow came swiftly. Newspapers and online blogs carried headlines dripping with venom. Prominent architect struggles with mental health issues, husband fears for her safety. Ethan's carefully worded statement painted him as the dutiful spouse, concerned for my well-being. His words turned my pain into spectacle. Soon after, Margaret's influence bled into every corner of the media she could buy. Articles described me as unstable, unfit, a woman consumed by paranoia and delusion. Talk show hosts speculated about my supposed breakdowns. My professional reputation, built from years of grit, sweat, and talent, was reduced to gossip fodder in less than a week. I sat in my small rented apartment, the walls bare, the furniture minimal, clutching my phone as I scrolled through the stories. The words blurred as tears filled my eyes. I pressed my hands against my face and sobbed, the sound muffled in the emptiness around me. I was no superhuman warrior, no invincible strategist. I was just a woman, betrayed, cornered, trying to keep breathing when the world seemed determined to strangle me. For hours I cried until my body felt hollow, and then, slowly, something steadier began to rise within me. The media storm hurt, yes, but I still had the one thing they could never buy or twist, the truth. The next morning, I met with Claire, my lawyer. We sat at her office desk piled with folders, the city skyline behind her. I slid the USB across the polished wood, followed by the financial documents Daniel had given me. "It's time," I told her, my voice hoarse but firm. "Release it all." She studied me for a long moment before nodding. "Once this goes public, there's no turning back. Are you ready?" I thought of Ethan's hand across my face, of Margaret's smirk, of the headlines calling me unstable. I nodded. More than ready. Within 24 hours, the first wave hit. Audio clips leaked online. Ethan's voice cold and calculating, Margaret's dripping with disdain. Then came the documents. Evidence of shell companies, hidden accounts, transfers disguised as consulting fees. The story spread like wildfire. Social media lit up. Carter conspiracy trended for days, memes and commentary dissecting every detail. Public sympathy shifted. For the first time, the narrative wasn't about the unstable wife. It was about corruption, greed, and betrayal. And then came the twist I hadn't expected. A man named Thomas Hale, a former associate of Ethan, stepped forward. He contacted Claire directly, offering testimony. When we met him, he looked weary, shoulders hunched as though carrying years of secrets. "I can't stay silent anymore," he said. "Ethan's been laundering money through his firm, international transfers, off-the-book deals. I helped cover it up, but I kept records." He laid a folder on the table. Inside was damning evidence, more than I could have hoped for. For a moment, I was stunned. I hadn't planned for this, hadn't even dreamed of such a gift landing in my lap. But I wasn't foolish enough to waste it. With Thomas's cooperation, Claire expanded the case. Now, Ethan and Margaret weren't just facing whispers of manipulation or financial mismanagement. They were staring down full-scale legal disaster. Prosecutors became involved. Investigations widened. Every attempt they made to suppress the story only fueled it further. I watched from my apartment, heart pounding, as news anchors who once called me paranoid now called Ethan a fraud. Margaret, once revered as the matriarch of a prestigious family, was reduced to footage of her shielding her face from cameras outside the courthouse. For the first time in months, I allowed myself a small, genuine smile. Not because the battle was won, it wasn't, but because the tide had finally turned. Yet, even in that moment of fragile triumph, I knew better than to relax. People like Ethan and Margaret did not crumble without a fight. They would claw, bite, and burn everything around them before admitting defeat. One evening, as I sat alone, sipping tea in the dim light of my apartment, I stared out at the city and whispered to myself, "They're not finished. They never are." And I was right. I could feel it, like a shadow pressing at the edges of my newfound strength. Ethan and Margaret still had one move left, one card hidden deep, and I knew with a bone-deep certainty that it was aimed directly at me. The courthouse smelled faintly of old wood and paper, a mix of tradition and judgment that seemed to hang in the air. I sat at the plaintiff's table beside Claire, my palms damp but my posture straight. Around me, reporters scribbled notes, their cameras flashing as Ethan and Margaret entered the room. Ethan's face was pale but defiant, his jaw clenched. Margaret's expression was composed, but her eyes darted nervously across the room. They still believed they could win, or at least destroy me before they lost. The proceedings had dragged on for weeks, a constant back and forth of evidence, witnesses, and statements. I had grown used to the rhythm, the slow grinding of the justice system, but I sensed today would be different. I could feel it in the restless shuffle of feet, in the way the judge's gaze settled firmly on us. When their lawyer stood to deliver what they clearly thought would be the decisive blow, I braced myself. He adjusted his glasses and began, "Your Honor, new evidence has come to light. Evidence that calls into question Mrs. Carter's credibility, her morality, and her fitness to be taken seriously in this court." On the screen behind him, photographs appeared. Grainy images of me at a cafe, sitting with Daniel, another of me leaning forward, listening intently. Captions flashed beneath them, "Intimate meeting." "Secret lover." The lawyer's voice dripped with false sympathy. "As you can see, Mrs. Carter has been engaging in an extramarital affair. How can we trust the claims of a woman so willing to betray her vows?" Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Ethan's lips curved into a smirk, his first real smile in weeks. Margaret's chin lifted slightly, triumph lighting her features. They thought they had me cornered, thought these fabricated accusations would strip me of any credibility left. For a moment, I let the silence stretch, let their confidence swell. Then, slowly, I stood. "May I respond, Your Honor?" The judge nodded. Claire pressed a small USB into my hand, her eyes steady, reassuring. I walked to the evidence screen, my heels echoing on the polished floor. The defense has presented images, but context matters, and so does truth. With a click, the video began to play. It showed the same cafe, the same table, but from a different angle, one captured by a security camera Daniel had managed to secure. The footage rolled, and there I was, sitting with him, papers spread out on the table. No intimate touches, no whispered confessions, just business, just evidence. Then, the twist. Another camera angle revealed a man in the corner of the cafe, Ethan's associate, snapping photos, deliberately cropping frames to tell a lie. The video froze on his face, unmistakable. The room erupted in murmurs, gasps, even laughter from some of the spectators. The judge rapped his gavel for silence, his expression tight with disapproval. I turned back to the defense table. Ethan's smirk had vanished, his face ashen. Margaret's hand gripped the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles whitened. "You tried to fabricate an affair," I said, my voice calm, almost gentle. "But the truth doesn't bend to your will. It never has. It never will." The judge leaned forward. "This court will not tolerate false evidence. Consider this a serious blow to your credibility." The weight of his words hung heavy. Ethan's shoulders sagged, his eyes dropping to the table. Margaret's lips moved soundlessly, as if she couldn't comprehend how it had all unraveled. And you know what? I didn't need to shout, or gloat, or claim victory. I turned slightly, meeting the gaze of the gallery, and thought, And you know what? I don't need to scream that I've won. Their silence, this silence, is enough. The remainder of the trial passed quickly after that. The recordings, the financial documents, Thomas Hale's testimony, and now the attempted fabrication, it was overwhelming. The Carter empire collapsed under the weight of its own corruption. Ethan was indicted on charges of fraud and money laundering. Margaret faced investigations for conspiracy and obstruction. Their legacy, their name, their power, shattered. When the judge finally ruled in my favor, the courtroom buzzed with noise, but I barely heard it. I sat still, letting the words sink into me. Justice. Not revenge, not spite. Justice. Outside, the sun was blinding. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, but I barely noticed them. The warmth of the day touched my face, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I lifted my chin and smiled. My cheeks were wet, though I hadn't realized I was crying. They weren't tears of sorrow, but of release. I didn't return to the Carter house. I didn't want the remnants of its walls or the echoes of its poisoned halls. Instead, I rented a small studio apartment with wide windows that overlooked the city. It wasn't grand, it wasn't polished, but it was mine. I poured myself into work again. Architecture had always been my anchor, and now it became my lifeline. I took on projects that mattered to me, community spaces, homes designed with care. My name returned to headlines, not as scandal, but as recognition for my craft. Each building I sketched, each model I built, was a piece of myself reclaimed. Evenings were quiet. I often sat by the window with a sketch pad, the city lights flickering below. Sometimes the loneliness pressed in, the memory of betrayal still sharp. But there was also peace, a peace I had never known in that gilded cage of a mansion. One evening, as I traced lines across paper, I paused to look at my reflection in the glass. My face was softer, calmer, yet in my eyes there was still steel, a reminder of what I had endured and what I had become. I whispered to the empty room, a vow more to myself than to anyone else. Never again. No one will ever control me again. And I believed it.